Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to bring you a science fiction and fantasy wrap-up. This is going to be a combination of new releases as well as some popular science fiction fantasy books that I'm finally getting to. And so I have some great books to talk about, some new recommendations, and a book that was super dark and weird, and well, I have thoughts on it, so let's get started. First, let's talk about The Undying Stars by Emery. This is a book that I received for review from Orbit Books, and this is a queer space opera story that is inspired by the lives and events of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. And picking up this book, I realized I knew very little about their history. I originally expected this to be more of a space opera romance, just because I thought it was more about their epic love, but instead it's actually more about how Cleopatra had to gain and grow into her power, and how Julius Caesar assisted her in getting to the position that she was in, because I didn't realize that when she was younger, her sister ended up claiming the throne and kind of throwing her out, and then she had to go and formed a bit of an alliance with Julius Caesar, and he assisted her in helping her to gain the throne that we know her today as a great leader of Egypt. So this is a book that I went into realizing that I didn't really know my history, and I ended up sitting down with my husband and we actually talked about some of the events, and after knowing that, this book made a lot more sense. I have seen from other reviewers that they complain that a lot of this book is about the earlier parts of her life, but again, I really think that people are just misunderstanding what retelling this is meant to be, or what aspect of Cleopatra's life is inspired in this story. And again, I like that while it's inspired by those events, my understanding is that this is very much its own story. It takes scientific and science ideas and brings them into the story, into a technological future, and it's mixed up. There's some queer elements to the story, and I found it to be a very compelling story. I thought the prose was fantastic. Now, in terms of style and tone, I would say this book reminded me a lot of a memory called Empire. I've seen that comparison by other reviewers and the marketing, and it really is spot on. So I would say that the characters are perhaps a little bit dry, and that was kind of my one complaint or downside of the story, is I didn't completely fall in love with the characters, or I didn't at least feel like I knew them very intimately. But this book was very well drawn, very well imagined. I thought it was sweeping and epic, and currently on Goodreads it's looking like a standalone, but I'm desperately hoping we're going to get more out of this future, because I definitely think there's more to tell. But this book is just unique, it's beautiful, and again, I think it draws from a unique part of history that a lot of us maybe don't know as much about, and it's just really intricate. It's not a romance, it has romantic elements, but it's really more of a story of a woman who has lost her power as her sister takes over and has to regain it back. Also, I want to quickly apologize to all the history majors out there, because I'm sure that I brutally simplified and glossed over the history of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar in my synopsis, but I just want to give everyone a taste of that, because I think a lot of reviewers are going into this expecting it to be more about when she was in power instead of the lead up and how she got there, which I thought was really well done, but just not what I expected at first. Now, switching over to fantasy, I want to talk about The Book Eaters by Sunyi, and this is a book that I requested from Tor Books for review. And this is more of an urban fantasy that follows a woman who is not actually human, but very human-like, and you find out that she is part of this other species, and they live amongst humans, and you find out that instead of consuming food as we would normally do, they actually consume books. This book, for whatever reason, gave me strong vibes of The Burrowers. These are not little people, they are life-size, normal, human-sized creatures, but for whatever reason it just gave me burrower vibes, and for that reason this book just felt really cozy to me. At the same time, I admit that this book is actually decently dark. It deals with some heavy topics and themes, and was just very unique. And again, that's something I'm always looking for. I don't read a lot of urban fantasy. I'm more drawn towards something like epic fantasy, but this one definitely caught my attention. I've seen it categorized as horror, and I wouldn't call it that, because I do think, again, it's lighter in tone. But was it unique and different? Absolutely. As with many reviewers, I suspect are going to agree that my favorite aspect of this book was easily the book eating. And so the idea is that each time they eat a book, they experience the book in a way through that consumption. So depending on what they're reading, it can give them different feelings and emotions, and they can learn from the book. So I think it's a very thematic way of addressing how we consume books and how they change and affect our lives. So I thought it was a really kind of fun twist on that, and will definitely appeal to readers that are probably the ones, of course, reading this book. So I do recommend it. It wasn't a perfect 5-star read for me, just because, again, I'm drawn towards more epic, dark stories, and this one was a little bit more cutesy than I expected, which again might be just my personal reading of it, but it was still really fun and I do recommend it. If it sounds up your alley, I think you'll enjoy it as well. Next, I want to talk about a trilogy that I binged through. The first one is The Tower of Fools, the second one is Warriors of God, and the third and final book, which just came out recently, was Light Perpetual. But essentially this is an epic historical fiction that is very light in terms of the fantasy elements. We follow an individual who is going about his adventures, and so we follow him through the books. And I like how each chapter basically starts with a quick summary of what's going to happen in that chapter, and it's kind of told in a way of like, oh, he's going to go here and stumble upon this, and it just kind of feels like you're following someone again through their adventures, and it feels in my mind very lighthearted. I'm not entirely sure if it was intended to be that way, if it was translated and made the tone lighter, or if I'm reading more into this book than I should. But I did enjoy these books. I do fully acknowledge that I didn't completely love them, and I think it's for the fact that I don't typically enjoy historical fiction, and while these books again are historical fantasy, the fantasy elements are really light and they tend to focus on a time period of history that is very European focused that I just don't find that personally interesting, but I know other readers will love these books. So this is the same author who wrote The Witcher, which I love. I love the video game, I love the TV show, and I have read through some of the books. I want to finish them, and so I was definitely curious to pick up more by this author. But this is a case where your love and experience with the Witcher series is not going to be indicative to how you feel about these books. I found these to be very different, and I've seen one of the main complaints from other reviewers is the fact that the main character is very different than Geralt from The Witcher, and I don't criticize the book for that. I think it would be kind of cheap if he just remade the same character and gave him a different name, but I think a lot of us are really drawn to The Witcher because of Geralt's personality and how he fights monsters and so forth, and this guy is just more of a bumbling fool. Again, I just found this book to be a little bit more funny and jokey, and I just found the character to be very frustrating because it felt like he just kept stumbling into situation after situation, and it continues on throughout the books. I think it's a solid series. I think if you love historical fiction that is centered around Europe, you will enjoy these more than I did, but I just didn't love these characters, and so you spend a lot of time, particularly with this one individual, that I just didn't love. So I think your mileage with this series will depend on how you connect with the main character and your interest in that particular subgenre of fantasy. Next up is Perdido Street Station by Miéville. This is a book I've been dying to read for so long. I even bought myself a copy before reading it, which I never do these days because I was so confident it was going to be a favorite. If you're not familiar, this is a story that blends together a lot of genres. So it's weird fantasy blended with elements of science fiction and also a tiny bit of horror. And the whole story takes place within this city, which is dark and grimy. There are different characters we follow. There's a few main perspectives, one being Isaac, who is a bit of a rogue scientist. And we also follow his lover or girlfriend, Lynn, who is an artist. And I feel like reviewers really hold back on saying much more about the plot, so I want to do the same, so I'm not giving away too much. But this is a book that packs in a lot of different ideas. It deals with a lot of themes involving class and societal ideas and politics, and I can barely summarize it without giving away too much, and I can barely summarize it because this book is also a lot to take on. I think people are either going to love or hate the writing style because the author is very verbose. I personally liked it. It is a pretty long book. I think it's like over 700 pages depending on what copy you read, but I really enjoyed how the author described everything. For me, the best element of this book was the world building. I loved how the city was described. I loved how unique and intricate everything was. Besides just humans, there's other creatures, there is bioengineering, and so you hear and read about these really unique creatures, and I'm someone who does at times struggle with how to picture things, and I did struggle with that at times in this book, that they were describing really weird things and I'm like, I don't know how to picture that, but I almost wonder if that's a bit on purpose. I don't know if it's meant to be clear or not, but the ideas that popped into my head were all very weird and fantastical, and again, just unique. I'm always looking for a unique fantasy book, so even though this book was a little bit over my head at times, I really enjoyed so much of it. The plot is huge, the themes are epic. I know I missed some of the political theming within this book, and this is definitely one I plan to reread because I know I didn't get everything out of it on the first pass, but what I did enjoy within this book, I enjoyed quite a bit. I'm excited to read more by this author. I do plan on reading The Scar, hopefully very soon. But overall, I did enjoy this one, even though perhaps it wasn't exactly what I expected from it, but I would recommend it to those of you that love weird speculative fiction. It's a lot to take in, it's a lot to ingest and think about, but I like books, as I've said before, that make me think, that challenge my ideas and really make me work for it. And this is one that is definitely a challenging read, but also very rewarding. And finally, I read Nevernight by Jay Kristoff, which is the first book in his assassin fantasy series that follows a young woman who, as a younger child, her father was killed off in a terrible way, and that led her to become an assassin, and so we follow her. There is a love interest within this book, and we follow her in her assassin journey. She also goes to a bit of an assassin school, so I did enjoy those parts because I always enjoy a magic school in any sort, and kind of learning how all of the rules work. There's something about magic schools that just always draw me, and it's very tropey, but I love it so much. This book is told in a very unique narrative style, so within the book there's just a really distinct way that he writes, so there's a lot of descriptions and similes, and it's the kind of story that is either going to rub people the wrong way or you're really going to like it for the most part. And also within the book there are a lot of footnotes. Footnotes are something I'm hit or miss with. I do find that they kind of jar or stop my reading experience. I am a very fast reader, and so at times I find it irritating to have to stop my flow of reading to go and read the note. So knowing that this one had footnotes, I did decide to do the audio, which is not my favorite way to consume books with footnotes, because the narrator does the work for you of putting the footnotes in behind the right sentence, and so you don't have that breakup of narrative flow where you have to kind of start and stop and move your eyes to a different part of the page. Just a personal pet peeve. It slows me down when I'm reading, which is not my favorite thing. But within the story, it's very unique. I can see people loving it, I can see people hating it, and I'm actually surprised to say that I'm more middle of the road on this one than I expected to be. At the beginning, I really loved the story. I loved how dark it was fierce, and again, while I didn't completely love the narrative choice, I found it to be very distinct, which is something I appreciate. But my main complaint as the story went on is that it started to read very young adult, and what I mean by that is there's something about the narrative style or tone that just rubbed me the wrong way, or specifically reminded me of a young adult book. And while this book is definitely classified as adult, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it still reads like YA in my opinion, something to do with the narrative style and tone. Now, before everyone goes crazy in the comments, yes, I acknowledge that this book has huge content warnings. It's very adult in terms of extreme violence. There's lots of swearing, there's lots of sex on the page and all of that. But I have said before, and I'm going to say it again in a video, that just because a book has adult content doesn't mean that it can still not read like YA. It just reads like incredibly inappropriate YA, so you should not give it to a young person, but it still has the narrative structure that makes it feel young, despite the author shoving in these really adult themes. And along that note, what I felt like the author was doing was purposely putting in all of this adult content in order to solidify this book's position on the adult shelves. And it just felt like he was trying a bit too hard to prove that his book was super adult. And from there, I just started to get bugged by that, because I've read plenty of adult books that are very messed up, very adult, have a lot of adult content, and ones that don't. And this one just felt like it was just trying way too hard to prove itself. And again, maybe I read way too much into that, but it really brought the book downhill for me. The story itself was good. I enjoy the narrative, but I realized that assassin stories are very action focused, which isn't really the draw when it comes to fantasy for me. I'm much more interested in the characters, political maneuvering, things like that, and action scenes just kind of, I don't know, they don't really work with my brain. I'm not a very visual reader, and so I just tend to gloss over them and not get a lot of actual reading enjoyment out of them. So I just don't know if assassin fantasy is for me. All that being said, I liked parts of this book, but not enough to continue on with the trilogy. I was pretty underwhelmed, and like I said, I got a little bit annoyed with the writing and narrative style, and just something started to rub me wrong, which is exactly the point when I need to let a book go, let a series go, and just move on to another book that's more up my alley. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to hear of the books I talked about. Which ones are you planning on checking out for yourself? I'd love to hear if there is a book that rubbed you the wrong way, or a book that was marketed to you as an adult book, but when you read it, it felt really young adult. Even again, if there was some adult content, something about it just made you feel like it should have been in the YA shelves. So if I'm not the only one, I'd love to hear down below in the comments. If you're new to my channel, consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror, thriller, science fiction, fantasy, and true crime. And if you want to help me out with this video, you can give me a thumbs up, share it around online, drop a comment, even if it's just, oh, I don't know, what's something, I don't know, figure out an emoji. You be the creative one for once. And if you want to help me out, you can hit that little notification bell. That way you'll never miss a video from me. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.